Hello, everybody. It's time for Tune In with Trevor, and today's special guest is Harold Bronson, who is the founder of the legendary Rhino Records and also an author. Let's welcome Harold, and let's get into Rhino. What was Rhino? What is Rhino?
Okay, so Rhino Records started out as a record store in the Westwood area of Los Angeles, which is close to UCLA. And Richard Foos was the owner, and I started working there. But prior to that, when I attended UCLA, I got into writing for the UCLA Daily Bruin about music, and I became good enough so that I could make money writing for Rolling Stone and the rock magazines and not have to get a summer job. So when I graduated from UCLA, I wanted to get a job at one of the major labels, which didn't happen. But in a roundabout way, that related to me going to Richard and saying, let's start a label in the back room of the store. But what kind of precipitated that was when I was at UCLA, I had a rock band, Mogan David and his Winos, and I self-pressed 2 singles and an elaborate album, which was kind of like the Who's Live at Leeds with lots of inserts, but we made like fun of ourselves. So it was a fun project. But what I want to say is I had at least a little bit of knowledge with Richard to say, I know how to do this, let's do this. And that was a few years before later on in the 70s with the punk movement, and there was more of a DIY movement at that point, but this was, a few years before that.
But one of the things about Rhino was the tongue-in-cheek aspect of it. I mean, I remember you put out Wild Man Fisher.
Yes, first album.
And what were some of the other first releases?
Okay, well, where the humor initially came from, when Richard in the early days of the Rhino store, there'd be few customers, he even counted there was one day when there were no customers, so he would think about, what do I do? To amuse himself, he would make up funny signs, like the worst customer list and things. So he's a person that introduced to me the concept that you could have humor in retail, which people weren't doing, because in retail, you want to sell what you have in stock. You're not thinking about making jokes and fun stuff. So that translated into when we started the label. Humor was a part of it, and one of the first the successes in the early year was the Temple City Kazoo Orchestra, which we did together. And the idea is, isn't it funny, kazoo playing rock and roll songs that you know? But there was, like that in a number of our releases, there was also a subtext. In this case, Richard felt that rock and roll had gotten so serious and so pretentious, meaning a good example being Led Zeppelin, that in order to comment on that or satirize on that, if you took their serious song, Whole Lotta Love, and you played it with kazoos, then that was sort of...
I have to tell you a story. So I was in the record business at that time, and I brought the Temple City Kazoo Orchestra to the International Music Convention, MEDEM, and played it for the first time for the guy who was there for ABBA, and said, now listen to this. I played him a Whole Lotta Love, and he looked at me like I was from outer space, and then he got it.
That became an unexpected hit on a small level because of, certain progressive radio stations playing novelty stuff, and this appealed to them. But this came out towards the end of 1978, and the problem for us was that that was one of the last 2 big years at the time for the record industry. You had Michael Jackson, you had Fleetwood Mac. So not only were the major labels using, at capacity in their pressing plants, they were going to the independent pressing plants, which we used. We couldn't get a record pressed for the month when it was the hottest.
Well, one of your other ones was Louie. Tell us about that.
So this, came out a bit later. The idea was, the early days of Rhino, we love the Novelty records we grew up with. We love supporting the LA bands, or a lot of good bands, and reissuing older music. Unfortunately, reissues were the only ones that were consistently profitable. So that became the focus of the label, which we were really good at and excelled at. So one year, we had a particularly good year, so we said, let's have some fun. What can we do to have fun with this? And the typical best of album would be like the best hits or greatest hits of one artist. Nobody had done a hits album with 10 different versions of a song. And Louie, Louie by the Kingsmen at that point were the subject of a couple radio stations that over weekends would do Louie Louie-a-thons, where they would play all the different versions, one after the other. So Richard said, look, let's treat ourselves. Let's do this fun project. Let's do 10 different versions of Louie Louie on an album. It was an absurd, outrageous concept, because who would buy 10 versions of the same song? So we thought, okay, if we sell 3,000, we'll break even. Let's have some fun. If we lose some money, it's okay. And through the years, that backfired because it ended up selling over 100,000 copies. So it was always nice when you have something that you think is marginal and you're doing it for good reasons or to expose music or the artist, and it ends up being, a moneymaker or even, more so.
I think what Rhino did, tell me if I'm wrong, but is you were the first entity to really do loving releases, compilations that the majors had not been doing up to that point. In other words, your notes and the packaging.
Okay, so where we were coming from is we were passionate music fans. This music was important to us growing up. And when we started to reissue, we thought, well, how do we reflect how this music is important to us? So the idea was, let's track down really great, rare photos, insightful liner notes. Let's make it sound really good. So we put money into the projects. Typically, when a major label would even make this available, in the days when they were going after gigantic, multi-million selling Fleetwood Mac and Michael Jackson records, their attitude would be, how can we spend the least amount of money to reissue this? So that really worked for us and a lot of passionate fans who, felt
and
like we did.
And you were able to get the cooperation from the major labels. How difficult was that?
Well, sometimes it was easy and sometimes it was difficult. But when it was difficult for no reason. For instance, it wasn't like in the United States, Capitol Records had the best of the Spencer Davis group out. They didn't, but they, turned us down, or they were suspicious, or they didn't want to deal with it. And so that maybe took us 2 or 3 years to put out. So fortunately, we were able to make most of it happen, but from time to time, there would be deals that should have been made that for no other reason, we just weren't able to make the deal.
Well, one of the things that put you on the map was the Rocky Horror Picture Show. What's the story there?
That was, so originally, Rocky Horror was a play in the West End in London. It was successful. And Lou Adler, who was a record producer and also was a part owner of Dunhill Records, mostly known for having produced the Mamas and Papas and those hits. And then later on, Carole King and her big success that was on Ode Records, which was his label. So he got the US rights. So that's how that started. And that was a very successful play in Los Angeles at the Roxy Theater. And that became a movie. But the movie was unsuccessful initially for a number of years. And it was one of those type of movies that when independent theaters were having midnight screenings, it became a phenomenon through the years. Phenomenon. And that created, interest. So we made a deal with Lou Adler and put out a number of the Rocky Horror albums, the original Roxy, the soundtrack album. I think we did a fan thing, but we had a really good relationship with Lou. He also produced Cheech and Chong. We put out Cheech and Chong. So some people got Rhino, other people didn't. Other people, artists, didn't necessarily care that we were putting all this love and quality into these re-releases. You know, for them it was just hard dollars. What are you going to give us? I guess I should say that a lot of these stories and things we're talking about are in initially the Rhino Records story, which was the book.
That's one of the things we can mention that now. You put out a book.
Yeah, so the reason for that was, so with my background in journalism, unlike a lot of executives and people who write books, I actually knew how to write. It was the ability, because we had moved on from Rhino, it was now part of the Warner Music Group. I wanted to capture the history of the label because I felt that if I didn't do that, it would be lost. So that was the motivation for doing that book. And it just, it was a great company. We were very humane in how we treated our employees. We were in positions to pay the artist directly. It was important for us to pay the artist because, again, growing up, these records were important to us. You know, who made the records? It was the artists. And as we got to learn about the music business, especially, you know, years past, it really appalled us that a lot of these artists, if not maybe most of them, were ripped off. It bothered us. So when we were in positions to pay people, it was definitely a priority to do that.
You were known and for paying people. I had experiences with that as a music attorney.
Yes.
Let's talk about the Monkees.
Yes.
You brought them back. What happened?
Yes, well, Monkees were important to myself and Richard and so many other people growing up. But, you know, it was more than just this funny TV show and they made good records. I mean, the reason why interest in the Monkees sustained to even now is that the songs were exceptional and the performances were good. And even with the Monkees, they were all competent vocalists. But more to the point, their personalities came through. There's a real difference of somebody being a competent or a good vocalist and somebody else being able to convey, say, intimacy or other aspects. And, you know, the Monkees, Mickey Dolenz, Davy Jones primarily, they were great at doing that. So we were reissuing Monkees, initially rarities, and then the original albums because, you know, the original label didn't want to put those out. And then coincidentally, when MTV ran the Monkees over a couple weekends, all the episodes, this was in 1986, it was a phenomenon. They got such response that they started programming it. And by virtue of the fact that we had the product out, we recharted with 7 of the original Monkees albums, and the only other artist at that time who had charted 7 albums at the same time was Pink Floyd. So it was great for us. It was great for the Monkees. We did a new album with them in 1987, and a few years later, we actually made enough money so that when the original producers offered to sell the catalog and the rights to us, we were able to do that.
All right, let's go to the Dave Clark Five. They were probably the biggest band after the Beatles.
Yes.
What was your experience with them?
Okay,
Dave Clark in particular.
I was a big Dave Clark Five fan. So in 1964 and 65, they were number 2 to the Beatles in the U.S. And for a number of years, I would, like, once a year, I would send Dave a letter, like, I'm going to license your catalog.
He owned the product.
Yes. Dave was not well schooled, but had good instincts, and he made a lease deal originally back in the 60s so that after 5 years, he got the rights back. So, but, you know, he miscalculated, and he felt that by keeping it off the market for so many years, that it would increase value and increase interest, when actually the opposite happened, meaning that oldies radio stations that programmed the Dave Clark 5 hits, that when a copy wore out or got misplaced, there was nothing that they could replace it with. So fewer of the songs were played on oldies radio. They weren't used in movies, TV shows, commercials. So it was very frustrating for me because I wanted to, I thought we could have done a great job with the catalog. So Dave at a certain point made a deal with Disney for this English TV show, rock and roll TV show called Ready, Steady, Go. And because he had a relationship, he ended up making a deal with the new Disney label, Hollywood Records. And Disney was promising them, like, oh, we make the deal with our record company, we'll put your songs in our films, we'll do a Dave Clark 5 cafe at Epcot, in the World Center there with all. Anyway, none of that stuff happened. And we helped Hollywood Records with that and were involved a little bit. But after the fact, when that kind of fell apart, I had some meetings with Dave, and he was very charming, but he wanted to. Anyway, the long and short of it is, at that point, I said, "Look, let us take over the Hollywood deal, or we'll pay you more money. We'll do let's do a box set." I wanted to do all these things, and again, he was very difficult to deal with, and he just didn't make a deal with us. And to this day, they're the only major artists from the 1960s that never had a career-spanning box set. And I have a whole chapter on Dave in the second book I did, which was My British Invasion. It's been very disheartening. By the way, the theme for me personally, and also for us at Rhino, is turning people on to great music, or great music of the past, music that they might not have heard. And the idea is, there's a lot of great music that could affect people, but if they never hear it, then they can't respond to it. So, great example in the movie Ghost, Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers, a hit from the 60s. Ghost was, 25, 30 years later. That sold so well that our Best of our Righteous Brothers anthology went gold. Well, here's a better example. Quentin Tarantino, Pulp Fiction, opening credits, Miserlou by Dick Dale. Okay, Dick Dale in the early 60s was the king of the surf guitar, made great records, was not that well known nationally because Dick didn't want to tour. He didn't want to be too far away from his surfing spots. So he was like Southern California, basically. But anyway, what I want to say is that when people heard Miserlou, this great, by the way, originally the melody was a Lebanese folk song that, with heavy guitar on it. When they heard it over the opening credits, they responded to it. They bought the soundtrack album. They found out it was Dick Dale. They didn't know it was from 1962 in this 1964 movie. They were responding to the music. They didn't know where it was from. They didn't know who performed it. And so not only did, the soundtrack go, I think, gold, but our Best of Dick Dale ended up selling, I think, 250,000 copies, most of those sales after people experienced it.
You were in the movie business, too.
Yes.
So one of those movies was about Frankie Lymon. Who was he, and what was interesting about that production?
Okay, so again, with the idea of exposing music to people, and, like the Ghost example, people hear music, you're in a theater, great speakers, it's a great experience, and you could really respond to it. So part of my mission for the catalog that we controlled or owned was to try to expose it. One example was this movie. So Frankie Lymon was the first teen star. By that I mean when his group, Frankie, Lymon and the Teenagers, had a big hit with Why Do Fools Fall in Love, he was 13. He wasn't in, most teen groups who had hits, or actually teen appealing groups, were in their 20s. He was the first. He was like the Michael Jackson, probably, of the 1950s. And according to Billy Vera, who actually saw them both live, he said that Frankie was better than Michael Jackson.
Okay.
But anyway, so in 1983, I think, or 84, Diana Ross had a big hit with Why Do Fools Fall in Love. So the idea was that the ex-wife came out of the woodwork. There must be money here, right? So, and because of that, Morris Levy, the notorious label owner who had a bad reputation as far as being
honest.
Right. So he tracked down not one but two of the ex-wives. So there was a scenario of the three ex-wives battling it out for the estate. Now, where I first became aware of this, Stephen Fried was a noted author. He actually did a couple movies. Zola was his first movie, but he was a writer for the Philadelphia Magazine. He came to Los Angeles to interview Richard and me. He brought me a copy of his story. I didn't know about that story. And that kind of was the basis for us producing the movie. So yeah, that's what the movie was all about. The life of Frankie and the Teenagers, but the ex-wives. Real story there.
Julia, my producer, Julia, would you do me a favor and fly in these books right now?
Which book?
Well, we can do one at a time. Here you go.
So here's the first one. So here is the Rhino Records story by Harold Bronson, which is a fascinating account of how these two entrepreneurs built an incredible business and became moguls, believe me. The next one is the British Invasion. What is this book?
Okay,
Harold?
so that was a passion of mine, that music. And while I was waiting for in the production for this to, I thought, oh, a lot of these artists never had books. So there's lots of books on the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who. But how about the Yardbirds, Herman's Hermits, the Spencer Davis Group, the Trogs? So I'd interviewed a lot of these people in the 1970s when people weren't talking to them that much, and I got their stories. And then there's a few chapters that relate to interactions with the at Rhino, like the Dave Clark Five and the Kinks. So that's...
All right, and we have the latest one, Time Has Come Today. What is this?
So all the stuff I couldn't put into these two are in diary form. So why this works is that whatever happened yesterday, in yesterday's entry, doesn't need to relate to today or tomorrow. And Time Has Come Today was the big hit by the Chambers Brothers. And the theme of that is that when you're reading the book, time of the past comes today because you're reading it today.
Okay, so what fun this has been to have Harold Bronson, who he and I go back with a long way. And what you can see is how a fan is doing what he loves, and it turned out great for everybody, not only him, but for the entire audience for popular music. It's time now to tune in with Trevor, and subscribe at the same time, and be around for the next episode. Thanks.